The 17th century philosopher René Descartes wrote that good sense is the most evenly distributed commodity in the world. For everyone thinks he has just the right amount, and even those people who are the most difficult to please in all other matters never want more than they already have. We all think that we know how to think and know how to do it well. The 3rd century Neoplatonist philosopher Porphyry defined what it is to be human as being a rational animal. To be logical, he thought, is just a part of our being. It is who we are. That view was the cornerstone of the movement we call the Enlightenment. And it gave us much of the cultural infrastructure we take for granted today. Why do we have elections? Because if two competitors make their strongest arguments before the public, the voters, being rational animals, will select the better candidate for office. Why do we have juries? Because if you take any 12 random people, tell them all the facts of the case, present them with competing arguments for guilt and innocence, the members of the jury, being rational animals, will determine the truth of the matter. Why do we have marketplaces? Because when presented with competing goods at a variety of prices, consumers, being rational animals, will always choose to buy the best product at a fair price. We've arranged our entire civil society around the idea that we are logical beings, naturally capable of rational thought. We want freedom and liberty because we know what's best for us. We don't need to be told. We just need to be released to live according to our own good sense. Unfortunately, the world's a bit more complex. In the same way that there are optical illusions, images that'll trick our senses into thinking they perceive something they do not, there are what we might term cognitive illusions. That is, ways of thinking that convince us we're right about something we believe when we are, in fact, completely wrong. Contrary to our beliefs, we're not wired to be completely rational. Indeed, there are multiple factors leading us to be irrational. Some of these are psychological, some of them are sociological, and some of them are cultural. But understanding that they're out there is the first step to realizing that we need to think carefully about thinking carefully and to teach ourselves how to think in ways that are the most likely to avoid errors. One of the more well-known examples of being led to irrational belief comes from psychologist Solomon Asch's experiments in the early 1950s on conformity. Asch was a professor at Swarthmore who ran a series of experiments. The subject of the experiment would sit at a table with several other people he was told were also participating in the experiment, but, unbeknownst to him, were really Confederates working with the experimenter. Now, it was explained that this was a study in perception and that they would be shown a series of charts with different length line segments labeled A, B, and C, and they just needed to say which one was the same length as a fourth line next to them. Simple enough task. The table was arranged so that the subject would answer last, after the others said aloud which line they thought was the same size as the comparison line. The first chart was shown, and all of the Confederates answered correctly, and so did the test subject. Same for the next chart. But then, on the third try, the Confederates all gave what was obviously the wrong answer. C was the same size as the comparison line, but they all said A. When it got to the test subject's turn, 12 out of 18 times in the original study, and it's been reconfirmed many times since, the test subject gave the wrong answer so as not to stick out. Not conforming with the group is something we fear, and we do things we know are wrong in order to get along with the majority. What Asch shows is interesting, that we'll act in such a way as to do something contrary to our reasonable beliefs. But the people who gave the wrong answer to fit in knew it was wrong, right? Well, that's where it gets interesting. Interviewed after the fact, most said, yeah, I knew it was wrong, but I didn't want to embarrass myself or mess up the researchers' data by being different. But then there were others who, more interestingly, said, because the task was so easy, and because the others answered so quickly and confidently, they started to doubt themselves. We can't all be right since we disagree. Since they all seem to agree with one another, I must be wrong. Asch's study was about what people would do, whether they would be willing to act in a way that they knew was wrong. But what came out was, in some cases, it wasn't just about their actions, but about their thoughts, about the way in which humans will change what we believe in order to fit in with those in our environment. This is what psychologist Irving Janis called groupthink. Groupthink occurs when we sacrifice our own critical capacities of thought in order to adopt a consensus belief. All other things being equal, we would not have come to hold this particular belief, but because we're in a group that believes it, we do too. It's not just that we act as if we believe it, we do believe it. Janis, Ash, and a couple generations of researchers following them have documented all sorts of factors that amplify or diminish groupthink. If those around you are unified in expressing the belief and do so passionately, you're more likely to get swept up in it. But if even one person expresses skepticism, you're more likely to be skeptical yourself. If there's a strong charismatic leader espousing the view, people are more likely to come to believe it. If there are rewards for believing or punishments for disbelieving, people will respond. Our beliefs are affected by the beliefs, actions, and personalities of those around us, even if they violate what we otherwise know to be good reasoning. Documenting this has become the task of social psychology. And these researchers have documented many ways that we naturally reason badly, what they call cognitive biases. Many cognitive biases have been discovered and replicated in multiple experiments. Some involve behaviors, effects like hyperbolic discounting, where we will irrationally choose less of a reward now instead of delaying gratification for more of a reward later, even if the greater reward is absolutely certain to be granted. Or there's what's come to be known as irrational escalation effect, where we'll judge an action less risky than we know it is because we've already invested in it. These are the throwing good money after bad instances where we've already put in so much time, money, or energy into something that we're unable to extricate ourselves from the situation, even when we know full well that it would be the rational thing to do. So, Porphyry and the Enlightenment thinkers' view of humans as purely rational beings turns out not to be true. Our ultimate interest in cognitive biases involves the ways in which we are innately wired to acquire false beliefs. We know that we act contrary to what we know to be rational, but just as interesting, or even more so, are the ways in which we are regularly wrong about what is rational. Now, researchers Ralph Raber and Norbert Schwartz have shown that the font of a sentence will have a measurable effect on how likely we think it is true. The clearer the words are visually, the more stock we put in their truth. If it's easier to read, turns out it's easier to swallow. In the musical Fiddler on the Roof, Tevye sings "If I Were a Rich Man," in which he says that if he were wealthy, people would come to him constantly for advice on every conceivable topic, and notes that it won't make one bit of difference if I answer right or wrong. When you're rich, they think you really know. What's being referenced here is what psychologists call the halo effect. If someone is successful or has a virtue in one way, say the person is successful in business, then we'll take it as evidence that they're an authority in whatever they do or say. And it's not just in terms of successful actions. It's also true if the person's good looking. If someone we think is attractive tells us something, and someone unattractive tells us the same thing, we're much more likely to believe it when we're told by the good-looking person, even with the same or less evidence. We have a positive outcome bias. That is, we think that we're more likely to succeed at tasks, win at games, or have good things happen to us than is actually the case. We imagine ourselves after the positive outcome, and because we can envision it so clearly in our mind's eye, we come to think that it's more probable than it is. This leads to irrational exuberance in the stock market, as Alan Greenspan, former chairman of the Federal Reserve, once put it. It's what leads us to play the lottery. Now, we know objectively that the chances of winning are next to zero. But when we think about what we would do with all that money, we overestimate the odds of it actually happening. We overestimate our abilities. The overconfidence effect is the name given to the irrational degree of belief we put in our own choices, even when we know they're random. This always amused me in watching the television program Deal or No Deal, in which random suitcase was selected which contained an amount of money, and the contestant would be offered varying quantities of money to surrender the unknown amount in the suitcase. The offer made was always slightly less than what a rational person would accept in order to keep the game going. But often, the players would be extremely certain that his or her suitcase was the one with the highest dollar amount. The player knew that the case was selected randomly, and that the odds of it containing the best outcome was no more likely than any other case. But the fact that it was the case selected led to an irrational confidence in the positive outcome. What's interesting is that this effect is amplified when the person is the most ignorant. We are the most overconfident about our abilities to do that which we actually know the least about. The Dunning-Kruger effect is the name given to the fact that the less people know about an area or how to do something, the more likely they are to overestimate their ability to do it or understand it. The more ignorant we are, the more brazen we are in our belief about our abilities and our knowledge. Now, should, of course, be the opposite. While this ought to be worrisome enough for those of us who want to think of humans as inherently rational, it gets worse. Psychologist Benjamin Libet in the 1980s ran a series of experiments that showed that the parts of our brain that determine our actions are sometimes triggered before the parts of our brain that make decisions. That is, our hand grabs the cookie before our mind has determined that we want a cookie and decided to have one. We shoot first and ask questions later, which, in this context, means that we act first and then use our brain to concoct some sort of justification after the fact that justifies our belief that the act was one of volition, that we did it because we consciously and rationally decided to. We act first and then come up with some sort of story that makes the action one that made sense, even if that justification has nothing to do with the real reason for the action. The challenge this has for our notion of free will is an interesting question, but not the one for us now. Rather, we're interested in what it means for our picture of humans as logical beings. We may not be rational animals, but we certainly are rationalizing animals. We find this sort of backfilling a justification type behavior on different cognitive levels. We suffer greatly from what social psychologists call confirmation bias. That is, when we hold a particular belief, we search out that which we believe supports the belief and explain away or outright ignore that which undermines rational belief in the proposition. When faced with a small amount of supporting evidence and a huge amount of disconfirming evidence, we focus on that which backs us up and take it to swamp the overwhelming evidence against us. Especially when the belief is core to our worldview, we will do incredible intellectual gymnastics to save it from falsification. We see this often in the world of politics. Now, if one party's in power and they're able to put their policies in place only to have them not meet expectations, what happens? Well, what should happen is that the policies and the intellectual framework that gave rise to them should be questioned. But that isn't what actually happens, is it? No. Usually the blame is placed on not going far enough. It's not the policy's fault. The idea had to be correct. If only we had even more of this policy, a stricter policy, then we would have passed the threshold that would have brought us success. It's not the fault of the policy, it's our fault, or more likely, our opponent's fault, for not going all the way. We will do whatever we need to in order to save our pre-existing beliefs. Where do these come from? That's the purview of sociology. We're acculturated into a belief system and the worldview it gives us. The basic categories and presuppositions that come with it are notoriously difficult to change. Emile Durkheim, one of the founding fathers of sociology, discussed what he called social facts, which we acquire from being part of a society. Social facts are ways of thinking or acting that originate outside the individual, are enforced by the society, and become a part of the individual. These are beliefs that become invisible to us because they're the lens through which we see the world, and questioning their truth strikes us as absolutely absurd, if not dangerous. Think of acts that at the time were bold political statements, but now seem absurd. Right? The Freedom Riders were a mixed-race group of young people who rode a bus together through the segregated American South, to be predictably met with violence. The courage of these activists is lost on kids today who respond to stories of the Freedom Riders with, people were violent because they were just riding on a bus? Who rides the bus? The thought of people getting riled up because women once wore bloomers or rioting in the streets because of an atonal symphony is laughable to us. The social facts have changed, but when they were enforced, the protection of these social facts seemed paramount. So, where are our culturally generated blind spots? What do we believe is necessarily true that is, in fact, completely false? We don't know, but figuring it out is the job of philosophers and cultural critics, and among the most important tools they employ is logic. We are not rational animals by nature, but that does not mean that we cannot be or should not be. Cognitive biases from our psychology and social facts from our cultural upbringing and political context may give us false beliefs, but we are capable of excavating and rigorously analyzing them. We can question what we believe, even our most deeply held beliefs, and objectively determine whether there are legitimate grounds for rational belief. For this, we need logic. It may turn out that there's a good reason to believe what we believe. In this case, our belief will be strengthened. If it turns out there's good reason to disbelieve it, then we will have saved ourselves from having a false belief, which could not only affect our other beliefs, but cause us to act in ways that have negative consequences for us and those around us. When we're aware of our psychological and cultural biases, we're able to step away from them and begin to think rationally. But it does not happen automatically. We may be aware of the sorts of cognitive biases that we've been discussing and still fall into them. Logical thinking is not an innate talent, but like riding a bike, it's a skill one can develop. It takes training and practice. You must see what makes some forms of reasoning effective at determining what's likely to be true and what makes other forms of reasoning likely to lead you into error, even though it seems attractive to us. And that is what this course is designed to do. We'll look at several different aspects of logical reasoning, from the practical to the abstract. We'll see how they work and how they fit together. This is important because there are people trying to get you to believe things all the time. You can't turn on the television or read the newspaper without having someone trying to get you to believe something. This course in logic is intellectual self-defense. What should you believe and what evidence is needed? If you believe A, do you also have to believe B? That's what logic tells you. Logic is a tool that allows you to evaluate the likelihood of truth of claims that are made based upon the reasons that are given in support of them. We'll begin our tour of the reasoning landscape with what we call informal logic. It's not called that because it's less rigorous or less disciplined in its approach, but because it looks at the elements of reasoning not resulting from the form of the argument given. This will let you, from the very first lectures, consider the types of cases that are made to you on a daily basis and determine whether there's good reason to believe what you're being asked to believe. From there, we'll look at inductive reasoning, the sort used in polls and scientific studies. We will examine formal symbolic logic, the sort of reasoning we all remember from high school geometry with its rigorous proofs. This is the logic of certainty. What can we infer with complete and total confidence? We will show how this extends to the way we think about the abstractions of mathematics and see how it makes mathematical truths a very special sort of truth. We will extend our system to include what we call modal logic, that is, the logic of possibility and necessity. How do we know when something just happens to be true and when it absolutely must be true? We'll see how this extends to, perhaps, being able to come up with a logic for ethical matters. Finally, we'll look at current advances, like three-valued logical systems and fuzzy logic, which extend our ability to reason by denying what seems like the basis of all logic, that sentences must be either true or false. Through this course, you'll come to understand basic concepts that can be applied to questions of daily life and see how those approaches give rise to interesting philosophical questions of their own. It's a mix of the applied and pragmatic with the abstract and conceptual. What this course will not do is turn you into something like the character Mr. Spock from the old Star Trek series. Logic is a tool. Becoming proficient with the tool does not in any way mean that one should not experience emotions, that one should discount intuitions, or that one should not fall in love. It's a false dichotomy to distinguish between the human being as one capable of reasoning objectively and the human being as a passionate being who feels emotion. The two are both parts of a well-lived human life. They are not mutually exclusive. But there is one warning I should give you. I think of courses like this as akin to classes in self-defense. When one trains in the martial arts, you're told that these skills are for protection, not for aggression. The same goes for logic. As one goes through life in this modern world, there are people trying to convince you of things everywhere. From advertisers trying to separate you from your money, to politicians trying to sway your vote, to friends who want you to agree with them. Your belief structure is constantly under attack. Now, this is not to say that all of these people are malicious, but certainly not all of them are giving you good reason to believe that they're trying to convince you of. You do need to be able to protect yourself logically. Now, that being said, the skills and knowledge that come with learning logic also need to be used responsibly. There are two dangers that come from understanding logic. First, when you learn how people can be led into false belief by use of particular linguistic tricks, do not use these to your advantage. As a philosopher, let me implore you to respect the search for truth. Secondly, once you learn to spot flawed reasoning, you will begin to find it everywhere. What used to sound reasonable and convincing will suddenly pop out at you in all of its egregiously wrong-headedness. Use this for self-defense. I once had an adult evening school student come up to me halfway through a logic class I was teaching and tell me that if she had taken this course years ago, her ex-husband would not have been able to get away with half of what he did. But you must still be humane as you are logical. If your friend Sally has been left by her longtime partner and sits with you sobbing, she may say things like, "Well, I was going to leave him anyway. I never really loved him." Don't point out the logical flaws in Sally's utterances. Put your arm around her, comfort her. Now, in your mind, you can analyze what she's saying, but just because you know it doesn't mean you don't have to say it. Logic can help you avoid being taken advantage of, but it also can lead to your acting like a jerk. What we will be learning here is powerful. You must be responsible. Logic is a skill that can be used to make better decisions and to ask better questions. What are those questions? And what do you need to do to acquire this skill? That's where this course will take us.